Welcome back, AI curious folk, to AI Ramblings number 63, Monday, April 27. I'm Michael Parekh, your human AI guide. And even I need a guide this week. So much going on. Let's kick it off. The big thing to kind of focus on this week is going to be not one, not two, but 5 of the Mag 7s are all reporting their earnings results this week. And investors who are especially super focused on all things, all tinges of AI, are going to be focusing on these results with a microscope. And we're going to see Amazon, Meta, Google, Microsoft all reporting on Wednesday after the close. And then Apple brings up the rear. And obviously, a lot of focus is going to be on the whole Tim Cook, new CEO appointee, John Turnus dynamic, if they choose to be both on the call. So that is the big kickoff to kind of look at for the week. The theme of the week, though, is redrawn and re-litigated deals amongst the big AI players. There's a lot of drama on this front that I wanted to discuss as 2 of the other topics this week. The number one thing is, and this is actually to OpenAI's favor, and as you know, they're getting ready for a big mega-IPO, $1 billion or more later this year. And they needed to do that. They needed to redraw their iconic in 2019 deal with Microsoft, where Microsoft, Satya Nadella, the CEO, took a huge bet and invested first $1 billion and then another $12 billion into OpenAI, which, if the IPO is successful, is going to be worth, a couple of $100 billion or more to Microsoft. But that's not their goal, as you know. But that deal had a number of elements that needed to be renegotiated for OpenAI to have a much more cleaner path, financial metrics to tell investors, etc., for their IPO. So that deal got really renegotiated very hard and redone. And there's a lot of details here, which I'll have in future posts, a post for tomorrow, actually. So you can look at that. I'll have it in the show notes. And I've written a lot about this as well. So we'll have a lot of details on this as well. But this OpenAI Microsoft redo of their deal is very notable. Microsoft had to give up certain things, but also they gained a few things. And specifically, the core thing that they gained are some additional elements to OpenAI IP post AGI, which is one of the core determinants thresholds in the deal. And there's going to be a lot of detail, which is not yet obvious from the initial announcement. There'll be a lot more that presumably will be out in the next few days. And yours truly will be here to update the discussion as we go along. But in general, they say, any deal in a hard-fought negotiation is only successful if both sides feel like they've not gotten all they want. And I think that was the characteristic here. One element that was also interesting was that OpenAI was able to exempt all of their consumer device efforts, AI efforts, from the deal with Microsoft. In other words, Microsoft doesn't get to share the IP or anything on the consumer AI side. And that's important because, as you know, OpenAI invested over $6.5 billion of their stock in Johnny Ive's design company, and the two are working together to build a portfolio of AI devices. And I'll have a lot of additional things to talk about toward the end of today's show shortly. So the second item beyond the earnings elements that I talked about for the week is the redrawing of this deal. The third element that I wanted to talk about today was the re-litigation of the original Elon Musk OpenAI agreement, to where Elon in the early days, over a decade, almost a decade ago, invested a huge chunk of change in a fledgling little OpenAI company that came about because of a late night conversation that he and Larry Page had. There's a lot of great origin story around here, which I'll have in the notes. I've written a lot about this in the show notes, so you can take a look. But the original origin of OpenAI was as a non-profit company, and that evolved very quickly when they realized how much money they were going to require, tens if not hundreds of billions of dollars, to be a for-profit entity. And the whole last decade has been a very extraordinary journey on that. And Elon is playing the Elon playbook on these kinds of things. He has his own mega IPO up, as I've talked about. this June for SpaceX. Who knows what he'll do with Tesla, which is also in the XAI game, etc. But he's playing everything from his usual playbooks, and one of those are litigation strategies. And here he has a potentially very embarrassing lawsuit, a jury trial underway. Today is the first day, the jury selection, etc. And this will go on for a little bit and provide a huge amount of fodder that'll be, a lot of drama and stories in the newspapers and magazines and online sites, etc. And likely will provide a huge amount of fodder for the ultimate movie or movies made on the origin of OpenAI, which I'm sure is in the works, just like The Social Network by Aaron Sorkin many years ago. I recommend it if you haven't seen it. So there's going to be a lot of drama and lots of ups and downs here, but I just wanted to highlight that because there'll be almost, every week there'll be a lot of detail around this that'll be coming out. So we've just got to be ready for it, and that'll make for a very unusual IPO season for all of these companies this year. It's going to be pretty dramatic. We'll get a lot of items probably in the discovery of some of these items that have probably not been made public. But I dare say we're not likely to see show-stopping things out of this trial that would impede OpenAI's pathway to an IPO if they're able to get all the other elements around that they need. And there's a lot of work to be done beyond just the drama and the origin story aspect of OpenAI. They've got a lot of wood to chop to make sure that everything is put together to assemble a bulletproof story, not only to take the company public, which I think they can given everything they've been able to accomplish, but remember, an IPO, and as someone who was a research analyst on a lot of the iconic IPOs in the internet era, and that requires a huge amount of preparation. They're also in a brutal race with Anthropic, which at the moment is surpassing the growth metrics relative to OpenAI. So OpenAI has a lot of things to keep an eye on in terms of almost they're playing multiple tennis matches concurrently. So it'll be interesting on that front, which takes us to, I just want to come back to the earnings season part of this discussion in terms of the big companies that are reporting. I've already mentioned the big ones obviously are Amazon, Meta, Microsoft, and Apple. And the thing I want to mention on that front is Amazon and Google, of course. Amazon and Meta are coming from behind. They're the ones with huge amounts of dollars at stake. Collectively, these four companies are probably going to again give us updates on how much they're spending in this quarter, and collectively it's going to be north of a couple of $100 billion and higher. They and the others like Tesla, which is Elon, and SpaceX are collectively all spending over $700 billion, and that includes a little bit of the numbers from the OpenAI and Anthropic side of the equation. Apple, of course, which reports on Thursday, is not building huge data center infrastructure or their own models, so they're in a different category. And I still continue to think that they're in a pole position on all things AI, especially with Google, who is going to be distributing their Gemini AI via Google, via Apple, and their Siri products and a lot of their other apps and so on. And we'll see a lot of news on that likely this June at the WDC, which is the Apple Developer Conference this year. So there'll be some indication on that as well. Amazon is going to be very focused, obviously, on how they're running hard with OpenAI's models. And that actually is an interesting tweak. We're going to hear from Amazon and Google and Meta about what they're doing in terms of their various big models, what are their updates on their spending plans, etc. But if you tie it to the second item, which is the redo of the Microsoft OpenAI deal, it's a really kind of, if you put it in a dramatic movie type of story framework, you have OpenAI and Microsoft that were committed to each other in terms of OpenAI's models only being available on Microsoft Azure for the last few years. Now, with this new redone deal, OpenAI is going to be able to host their models on other clouds. And one of the things that they've been really talking publicly a lot about is being able to and getting a lot of leverage from Amazon AWS. And Amazon is committing to invest more money into OpenAI, a circular deal, as it were. And so it's interesting that these two companies who've had a kind of deal with each other as solo providers of models and hosting are both going to be boasting their deals with other companies. So OpenAI is going to be highlighting how they're working with Amazon AWS with much better results with enterprise traction than their deal with Azure. And on the other hand, you have Microsoft is going to be likely on their call and other discussions saying, hey, we are making a lot of headway with Anthropic's models, with Claude Code and embedding it into GitHub, Copilot, and all these other things that they're working on with their enterprise customers. So both companies are going to be touting a little bit their new relationships versus their own exclusive relationship with each other. And that we're going to see a little bit on the quarterly calls this Wednesday. And as this redone deal gets more into the execution phase in the weeks and months to come. So that kind of highlights the three key items I wanted to talk about and my takes on all of this, which again, I'll highlight in the show notes and the write-up in the Substack post for this episode 63. Next item I wanted to talk about in terms of the Gadget AI section is that OpenAI, it was reported by a very plugged-in supply-side analyst who's Minkuo, who's been very good on all things Apple supply chain over the last few years. And he had a big report. He's really plugged into Asia, the Asian supply chain. And the report basically indicates that OpenAI is working with Qualcomm and MediaTek, which are two mobile processor providers, and Luxshare, which is a huge assembler of devices. Luxshare is a China-based company, a huge startup, about $60-70 billion market cap, that was built by ex-Foxconn executives. And Luxshare basically makes about 60-70% of all Apple gear, these AirPods, a lot of iPhones, etc. But they apparently are also getting a contract with OpenAI to build, guess what, an OpenAI smartphone, which will be built, presumably rebuilt from the ground up, from an operating system on upward, to really accommodate not just chatbots, but AI agents on smartphones. It's a huge endeavor. I think Luxshare was up a little bit, a few percentage points in Asia on this announcement. I've talked a lot about AI wearables and OpenAI's portfolio of products on AI products, which include now most likely a smartphone as well. But recognize that these kinds of efforts, especially with today's dynamics of supply chains, memory shortages, trade wars, geopolitical wars with China, all of those things tend to add a lot more headwind to building huge scale of products. So as exciting as this is, that OpenAI is focused on rethinking, probably on a first principles basis, what a smartphone ought to look like versus what we get from Apple's iPhone today and Google's Pixel and other third-party OEM smartphones today. That is a very interesting technical horse race over the next few years, but it's going to take time. So I just wanted to highlight that. It's something that if OpenAI really wants to do it at scale, it's a multi-year commitment that will require, $100 billion a year or more of expenditure once things get started, for everything from the vertical silicon, which they're doing the deal with Qualcomm and MediaTek from a processor point of view, but you've got to commit huge amounts of supply contracts for them to ramp up the production capability. And so that takes forward investment of 3, 4, 5 years, which again is a big commitment ahead of an IPO, where investors are going to be asking, hey, show me the money. A lot of dynamics here, but it is a new revelation from a very well-regarded trade analyst. And so I wanted to highlight that in terms of the AI gadget side of the equation. I'll have a lot more on these topics on future podcast episodes and also on the Substack side. So wanted to highlight that. This kind of brings us to the questions of the day. And one of the questions related to this, I was able to get, I think, kind of talk to some of this is, what do I think about AI smartphones? And I'll just say, I've written a lot about using AI agents today on today's desktop machines and so on. And it's very clear that the architecture, the operating systems of today's both computers and phones have to be fundamentally rethought for the world of AI beyond chatbots, meaning it's not just chatbots can work fine on the apps that we have on smartphones and on laptops, etc. But to do the AI agent piece, these things, the operating systems have to be redone. And so it is a very clear event horizon that I see here. And in terms of what's going on today, I would say Google is probably the best position of all of the smartphone companies because they have been obviously ahead with Gemini on AI, both on the language model side and in terms of application integration across the multiple Google products that have billions of users, and obviously their distribution partnership with Apple and Samsung and others. So they have the pole position in terms of AI smartphone functionality over the next 2 or 3 years. The number two, though, and I don't see them as behind, I think all of this stuff has to be invented and reinvented, is Apple. And I've written a lot about this. I think Apple has a lot of opportunity to build, especially a lot of open source smart language models into their operating systems and developer and application provider programs on the App Store, etc. And so they are a clear contender, especially on the supply chain side. And then I will put in the whole cluster of companies. Amazon has been rumored to be rethinking a smartphone, probably for the AI age. So is Meta potentially with their glasses and other devices, and now with OpenAI potentially. So all of them are also contenders, but again, software always lags hardware, and that typically adds 2 or 3 years to these timelines. So as excited as I am as a gadget freak, as an analyst, as a tech person who really focuses on all of this stuff from a bottom-up point of view, I want to temper my enthusiasm for the fact that these things take a lot longer than we think to build the functionality that we all kind of would like. And so the second question was, who do I think is in the pole position today? I've already kind of answered that. I think Google has the best near-term advantage with Apple number 2, and then everyone else coming down the pike. And OpenAI has a lot of exciting opportunities, but they also have a heck of a lot of other things on their plate to execute, especially this year in front of their IPO. So this is going to be a very busy year on this stuff. Still early days of the AI tech wave, as I've been talking and writing about. Just I would like to have you curious folk just keep pace with all the stuff that's going on, and we'll keep talking about it and keep your questions and comments coming. So again, thank you for joining us on AI Ramblings Daily 63 today. A lot more to come later this week. And as usual, your like and a subscribe is always appreciated. And stay tuned. See you tomorrow.